The shrill, accusatory tone sliced through my Monday morning like a rusty butter knife through a particularly tough bagel. "Mr. Thompson," the voice crackled from the tiny speaker of my smart doorbell, "I have photographic evidence of a distinct deviation from the community-approved color palette on your newly installed solar panel mounts." I pinched the bridge of my nose, the lukewarm coffee in my world's okayest sysadmin mug suddenly tasting like regret and beige paint chips. Here we go again. My life in Maple Creek Estates, that bastion of suburban conformity, where the only acceptable form of rebellion was forgetting to take your recycling bin in on time, was once again under the meticulous microscopic scrutiny of its self-appointed Grand Inquisitor. Carol Blevins, president, dictator for life, apparently, and general menace of the Homeowners Association. "Good morning to you too, Carol," I sighed into my phone, pulling up the live feed from the offending doorbell cam. There she was, standing on my perfectly manicured lawn. Another battle won after weeks of her passive-aggressive notes about uncharacteristically long grass, her silver hair gleaming under the weak autumn sun, clutching her omnipresent clipboard like it contained the secrets to the universe, or at least the proper placement of petunias. And with all due respect, the distinct deviation you're referring to is called black, as opposed to the previous's lightly less black, supplied by the contractor. Functionally, it's the same. Aesthetically, I'd argue it's an improvement. Less visually muddy. Carol's digital frown could practically melt the circuits in my phone. "The bylaws, Mr. Thompson, are quite clear. All exterior modifications must adhere to the pre-approved list, which, I might add, I personally compiled after extensive research into harmonious suburban design principles." Harmonious. The woman's idea of harmony involved a world where every house looked like it had been spawned from the same beige-tinted 3D printer. Right. The list that includes antique white, off-white, barely there white, and my personal favorite, existential dread white, I muttered, just loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "Are you being facetious, Mr. Thompson?" Her voice tightened, the pleasantries having officially expired. "This is a serious matter. The integrity of our community's aesthetic is paramount. Non-compliance will result in escalating fines, as outlined in Section 3, Subsection B, Paragraph 7 of the Covenant." Fines. That was her go-to. Apparently, the founding fathers of Maple Creek Estates envisioned a utopia funded entirely by penalties for insufficiently white window trim. "Carol," I said, trying to inject a modicum of reason into the digital ether, "these are solar panel mounts. Their primary function is to hold up several hundred pounds of electricity-generating equipment. The color of the metal attaching them to my roof is, I would argue, approximately the 743rd most important aspect of their existence. Functionality without adherence to our community standards is chaos, Mr. Thompson. Pure, unadulterated chaos." I could practically see her dramatically gesturing with her clipboard. "Consider this your formal notification. The mounts must be repainted to an approved shade within 7 business days. 7 business days. That's precisely 5 business days too long to let this fester." This wasn't about the color of a few brackets. This was about control. This was about Carol, in her infinite wisdom and boundless free time, deciding that my attempts to harness the very power of the sun were somehow a threat to the delicate ecosystem of perfectly manicured lawns and identical shrubbery. I ended the call with a curt, "Understood?" Though what I truly understood was that my afternoon was about to take a sharp, decidedly less beige turn. Carol wanted to play hardball with solar panel aesthetics? Fine. I had a few hardballs of my own, and mine ran on pure, unadulterated data. My name is Alex Thompson, And until about a year ago, my biggest concerns revolved around debugging code and optimizing network latency. Then I bought a house in Maple Creek Estates, lured by the promise of a decent-sized yard for my ridiculously energetic German Shepherd, Faraday. Yes, I'm a nerd. And the siren song of gigabit fiber internet. What I got was Faraday joyfully terrorizing the local squirrel population and an ongoing, low-grade war with the HOA, waged primarily by its indefatigable president, Carol Blevins. Our initial skirmishes were, in hindsight, almost quaint. There was the great trash can debacle of 23, where I apparently left my receptacle visible from the street for a full 12 minutes past the designated collection time, earning me a sternly worded letter typed in an aggressively formal serif font. Then came the gnome insurrection. I'd innocently placed a small, solar-powered garden gnome, resembling a Star Wars character, amidst my hostas. Carol deemed it unsuitable lawn ornamentation and demanded its immediate removal. I replaced it with a slightly smaller gnome, then a smaller one still. It escalated until I had a tiny, ceramic Yoda barely visible beneath a fern, and I still received a violation notice, complete with a blurry, zoomed-in photograph that could only have been taken with a telephoto lens from her upstairs window. The mailbox font fiasco followed shortly after. Apparently, my sans serif numbers were an affront to the neighborhood's established, traditional aesthetic. Each incident was more absurd than the last. Each violation notice felt like a tiny pinprick of bureaucratic tyranny. But the solar panels, that was different. That wasn't about petty aesthetics. That was about my own self-sufficiency, my desire to reduce my carbon footprint, and, let's be honest, stick it to the perpetually rising energy bills. My solar and battery backup system was my pride and joy, a meticulously planned and painstakingly installed piece of engineering that allowed me to thumb my nose at the frequently temperamental, local power grid. I'd sunk a considerable amount of money and even more time into Project Independence, as I'd dubbed it in my overly enthusiastic notes. Sleek, high-efficiency black panels adorned my south-facing roof, feeding into a humming rack of inverters and a bank of repurposed lithium-ion batteries in my garage. It wasn't just about the planet. It was about control. About having a stable, uninterruptible power supply for my work servers, my beloved gaming rig, and, crucially, my high-end espresso machine. The only real compromise I'd had to make was with the city permit office. Apparently, for safety reasons, the main emergency shutoff switch for the entire system had to be externally accessible for first responders. I'd grudgingly agreed, installing the heavy-duty disconnect in a locked, weatherproof box on the side of my house. It wasn't ideal. It was a single point of failure in an otherwise meticulously redundant system. I'd even caught Carol eyeing that box during one of her self-important neighborhood patrols, her gaze lingering on it with a disturbing intensity. It wasn't a question of if she'd mess with it, just when. The when turned out to be last Thursday night. A brutal thunderstorm had rolled through Maple Creek Estates, the kind that always sent the local power company scrambling. The lights flickered and died across the neighborhood, plunging everyone into darkness. Except for my house. My system had kicked in flawlessly, the inverters humming a quiet song of defiance. I'd even made a celebratory latte and stood on my porch, a smug silhouette against the warm glow of my living room, watching the faint beams of flashlights dance across my neighbor's darkened windows. I'd even seen Carol on her porch, her face illuminated by the pale light of her phone, staring directly at my brightly lit home. Then silence. A profound, unsettling silence. My lights flickered, dimmed, and died. My servers spun down with a mournful whine. My perfect, self-sufficient oasis of power had vanished. Heart pounding, I'd grabbed my most powerful tactical flashlight and plunged out into the still driving rain. The lock on the emergency shutoff box was jimmied, the cheap metal mangled. And the heavy lever, the one that required a deliberate and forceful action, was in the off position. And then I saw it. In the muddy ground beneath the box, a single, pristine footprint, the distinctive pattern of an expensive orthopedic walking shoe. The kind favored by middle-aged suburbanites who power-walked at precisely 7:15 a.m., rain or shine. And taped to the side of the box, the adhesive failing in the downpour, was a freshly printed HOA violation notice. Bold black letters on crisp white paper. Violation. Unapproved electrical housing. Structure to be removed within 24 hours. She hadn't even tried to be subtle. It was a blatant act of sabotage, wrapped in the thin, flimsy paper of bureaucratic nonsense. Standing there in the rain, the cold seeping into my bones, the cybersecurity analyst in me took a back seat to something far less rational, far more primal. The vengeful spirit of petty, technologically fueled retaliation had been awakened. Back inside, soaked and seething, the first thing I did was fire up my gas stove, bless its analog heart, and put on a pot of coffee. As the rich aroma filled the suddenly silent house, my mind, usually a well-organized server rack of logical processes, was a chaotic mess of anger and the dawning of a truly magnificent plan. Carol wanted to play dirty? Fine, I could play dirtier, and I had access to data she couldn't even begin to comprehend. HOA Karen tampered with my solar backup. 4 minutes later, I audited the grid and lit the block. The headline of my impending personal vendetta scrolled across the inside of my eyelids. It wasn't just about getting my power back. That was child's play. It was about exposing Carol, about revealing the hypocrisy beneath her perfectly pressed khakis and her iron-fisted rule. Step 1. Restore my own power. Trivial. A flick of the reset switch inside the now significantly less secure box, and my system hummed back to life. Step 2. Find a way to prove Carol was not just a nosy neighbor, but an energy-guzzling hypocrite. How? Audit the grid, the whole damn block. These new smart meters the power company had installed. They were essentially tiny, networked informants, constantly broadcasting their readings over low-power radio frequencies. They were supposed to be encrypted, of course, but having spent years in the delightful world of cybersecurity, I knew that "supposed to be" often translated to laughably insecure. The local utility company's security measures were probably about as robust as a screen door on a submarine. I'd bet my favorite caffeine mug I could sniff that traffic from my attic. My battle playlist, a bizarrely effective mix of rousing sea shanties and adrenaline-pumping 8-bit video game soundtracks, blasted from my speakers. I unearthed my trusty software-defined radio, SDR, dongle, a versatile little gadget that could listen to a wide range of radio frequencies, and paired it with a Raspberry Pi, the Swiss Army knife of the tech world. Within minutes, my fingers danced across the keyboard, conjuring a Python script to scan the airwaves for the telltale signals of the smart meters. The encryption, as expected, was about as challenging to crack as a fortune cookie. A few lines of code, a quick dictionary attack using a publicly available list of common passwords, and bam, I was in. Data packets flooded my screen, a torrent of numbers representing the real-time energy consumption of every single house on my block. I piped the data into a spreadsheet, creating a live dashboard of my neighbor's power usage. The whole process, from that first furious sip of coffee to having a block-wide energy consumption overview, took maybe 4 minutes, tops. Carol had thrown the switch on my solar backup. 4 minutes later, I was auditing the electrical soul of Maple Creek Estates. The irony was delicious, almost as good as that first post-blackout latte would have been if it hadn't gone cold. The next morning dawned bright and deceptively peaceful. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a world washed clean, except for the lingering tension in the air and the fact that most of Maple Creek Estates was still without power. My house, however, hummed with self-sufficiency, the solar panels already greedily soaking up the morning sun. I knew I needed a more permanent solution for that external shut-off switch, something Carol's orthopedic sneakers and her boundless sense of entitlement couldn't overcome. I called Gus. Gus was a semi-retired electrician and contractor, a man whose vocabulary consisted primarily of grunts, sighs, and the occasional perfectly timed expletive. He was the only person I trusted with this kind of work, a pragmatist who understood the delicate balance between code compliance and homeowner sanity. "Gus, it's Alex," I said into the phone, keeping my tone level despite the simmering rage within. "My HOA president tried to brick my house last night." A long, world-weary sigh echoed from the other end. "Carol?" "The one and only." "Figured." Another sigh, this one carrying a hint of grim amusement. "I'll be there in 30. True to his word, Gus's battered Ford F-150 rumbled into my driveway precisely 30 minutes later. He was a man built like a brick outhouse, with hands that looked like they'd personally wrestled copper wiring into submission. He surveyed the jimmied lock on my utility box, gave the heavy steel door a solid kick, and grunted. "Gonna need a NEMA 4X steel enclosure," he declared, his voice gravelly, "bolted directly to the foundation. You could hit this thing with a damn Sherman tank and it wouldn't budge. Gonna cost you." "Money is no object, Gus," I said, the words surprisingly true. "I want it to be able to survive a direct nuclear strike. Within reason, of course." Gus chuckled, a sound like rocks tumbling in a cement mixer. All right. I got just the thing. You know," he added, his eyes twinkling slightly. "I put in the wiring for her Christmas light display a few years back. Most ridiculous damn thing I've ever seen. Got its own dedicated sub-panel. Sucker pulls more juice than a small damn factory. Real hypocrite, that one." And just like that, Gus, the taciturn contractor, had unknowingly handed me the missing piece of my plan. The data was interesting, but it lacked impact. It needed a visual element, something undeniable, something that would illuminate Carol's hypocrisy for the entire neighborhood to see. Before unleashing my digital kraken, I decided to offer Carol a truce, a chance to back down with some semblance of dignity. I walked across the street to her house, a monument to beige perfection, adorned with an almost unsettling number of decorative flags flapping in the gentle breeze. I held the crumpled violation notice in my hand, a pathetic piece of paper that had ignited this whole mess. She answered the door with a practiced air of bewildered offense. "Alex," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What a surprise." "Carol," I began, holding up the notice, "we need to talk about this, and about my power being deliberately cut during a major storm." Her eyes widened in what I'm sure she thought was convincing innocence. "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. That notice was regarding an unapproved modification to your property. As for your power outage, perhaps you should invest in more reliable equipment." "Funny you should mention reliability," I countered, my voice dangerously calm. "Because my unreliable equipment was functioning perfectly until someone with a size 7 orthopedic walking shoe flipped the master switch. Ring any bells?" "That is a baseless and frankly slanderous accusation." Her voice rose an octave. "If you don't leave my property immediately, I will call the authorities." I smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of my lips that I knew would infuriate her more than any shouting match. "No need to call them, Carol. I'm sure they're quite busy dealing with actual emergencies. Just a word of advice. You might want to keep an eye on your own energy consumption. It can be very revealing. Have a great day." I left her sputtering on her doorstep, her face a study in apoplectic fury. I knew exactly what her next move would be. Carol's problem-solving strategy consisted of 2 steps. 1, issue a strongly worded written complaint, and 2, when that inevitably failed, call the police. 20 minutes later, a black and white cruiser idled at the curb in front of my house. Officers Miller, a weary-looking veteran with a permanent air of resignation, and Davis, a younger, more enthusiastic officer who looked like he'd just graduated from the academy, emerged. Carol, predictably, was standing on her lawn, pointing dramatically at my house. She'd apparently called 911 and reported that I had threatened her with computer hacking. The officers looked deeply, hilariously confused. I met them at my front door, but politely declined to invite them past the threshold. "Officers," I said, my tone calm and reasonable. "I'm Alex Thompson, the homeowner here. The individual across the street, Miss Blevins, is the president of our HOA. Last Thursday evening, during a severe thunderstorm, she deliberately disabled my private property's power infrastructure, an action which I have documented." I gestured vaguely towards my now secure utility box. "This morning, I simply advised her that excessive use of high-wattage appliances can lead to elevated utility expenses. I believe she may have misinterpreted my neighborly suggestion regarding energy auditing as a cyber threat." Officer Davis blinked rapidly. "So, you hacked her?" "Absolutely not," I said, with the air of a patient professor explaining a simple concept to a particularly dense student. "That would constitute a clear violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, not to mention basic neighborly decency. I was merely conducting a passive analysis of publicly broadcast radio frequencies in my immediate vicinity to ensure the integrity of my own home network's perimeter against potential external interference. It's a standard diagnostic procedure for anyone with a reasonably sophisticated home network." I threw in a few extra technical terms for good measure, enjoying the glazed look in their eyes. Officer Miller, who had clearly seen his fair share of suburban squabbles, stepped in. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Carol, who was still gesticulating wildly from her lawn, "this sounds like a civil matter. Unless there's been an actual crime committed, we can't really get involved." "But he audited the grid!" Carol shrieked, as if I'd committed some sort of profound digital indecency. Officer Miller sighed, the sound audible even from across the street. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm not entirely sure what that means, but it doesn't sound like something we handle. Maybe try contacting your internet service provider?" He and Davis exchanged a look of shared bewilderment, thanked me for my time, and retreated to their cruiser. As they drove away, Carol shot me a look that could curdle milk at 50 paces. I just smiled and waved. I had won this round, a minor skirmish in the grander scheme. But the real show was yet to come. The next few days were a blur of activity. Gus, true to his word, installed a utility box that looked like it belonged on a military installation. It was a fortress of steel and reinforced concrete, bolted directly to my foundation. "She ain't getting into that without a damn acetylene torch," he'd grunted approvingly. Meanwhile, I was refining my plan, meticulously gathering and analyzing the energy consumption data. I discovered, buried deep within the labyrinthine pages of the local utility company's website, that there was a scheduled grid maintenance outage planned for the entire neighborhood on Friday night, from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. It was perfect. A pre-announced blackout, providing the ideal canvas for my illuminated exposé. I hopped on a Discord call with Mark. my long-suffering best friend and designated voice of usually ignored reason. I walked him through the final details of Operation Beacon of Justice. Okay, so Phase 1 is simple, I explained, my voice buzzing with barely contained excitement. When the grid goes down, my house stays lit, powered by my now impenetrable solar fortress. Obvious, but satisfying, Mark chimed in, a hint of amusement in his voice. Phase 2 is where things get interesting. I'd acquired several high-amperage, remote-controlled power relays. My plan was to discreetly, and I'll admit, slightly outside the strict interpretation of the electrical code, connect them to the main power lines feeding the streetlights on my side of the block, as well as the exterior outlets of a few of my more agreeable neighbors. Dave, the quiet guy with the surprisingly sophisticated security camera, and Mrs. Henderson, the sweet elderly lady who always baked me cookies after my run-ins with Carol. I would be able to selectively power these circuits directly from my garage. Wait, Mark interjected, his voice rising in alarm. Are you seriously talking about hot-wiring the neighborhood? I prefer the term proactive microgrid management, I corrected him. It's temporary, purely for demonstration purposes, and entirely for the greater good. Right, Mark said dubiously. And Phase 3? Phase 3 is the pièce de résistance. I'd invested in a powerful outdoor projector, the kind usually used for backyard movie nights. My plan was to project the anonymized energy consumption data I'd collected onto my own garage door, blown up to an impressive 20-foot width, for the entire neighborhood to see. It would be a clear, color-coded bar graph, each house represented by a bar proportional to its energy usage. Except for one bar, of course. One bar would be flashing, a vibrant, unmistakable crimson, and clearly labeled, Highest Consumption 12 Maple Lane. A pregnant pause hung in the digital air. Then Mark burst out laughing. You magnificent bastard, you're actually going to do it! But wait, there's more, I crowed, reveling in his enthusiastic approval. Phase 4, the cherry on top. Remember how Gus mentioned Carol's ridiculously over-the-top landscape and holiday lighting having its own dedicated sub-panel? Don't tell me, Mark began, his voice filled with anticipation. I found a way to isolate that specific circuit, I confirmed. When the main grid goes down and I illuminate the block, I'm going to power only that circuit on Carol's property. Her house will be the only one completely dark, except for her absurd collection of inflatable Santas, glowing pumpkins, and strategically placed spotlights, all blazing in the darkness like some kind of suburban lighthouse of excess. Mark's laughter was now bordering on hysterical. Dude, I'm bringing popcorn and a drone. You need aerial footage of this glorious spectacle. Friday night arrived with a palpable sense of anticipation. By 9:55 p.m., I was ensconced in my office, surrounded by the soft glow of my triple-monitor setup. Gus had finished his work that afternoon. The new utility box, a silent sentinel against future tampering. Mark was on Discord, his excited chatter filling my headphones. Okay, folks, he announced, channeling his inner sports commentator. We're T-minus 5 minutes to the Great Beige Blackout. Alex, report. Systems are nominal, Mark, I replied, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. Batteries at full charge. Relays are armed and ready. Projector is calibrated. The beacon of justice is poised to illuminate. At precisely 10 p.m., the streetlights flickered, buzzed, and died, plunging Maple Creek Estates into darkness. A collective groan rippled through the neighborhood. My own house, however, remained a beacon of light, my solar and battery system kicking in seamlessly. I waited a full minute, letting the dramatic tension build. Then, I executed Phase 2. With a few clicks of my mouse, the streetlights on my side of the block flickered back to life. A surprised cheer erupted from somewhere down the street. Next, Dave's porch light snapped on. Another louder cheer. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson's windows glowed warmly. Simultaneously, Carol's house remained stubbornly dark, a gaping maw of unlit windows, except for her landscape lighting. The 20-foot inflatable Santa she inexplicably kept inflated year-round, puffed to life with a whoosh. The glowing jack-o'-lanterns from last Halloween winked on, and the 6 powerful spotlights aimed at her flagpole blazed, cycling through their programmed patriotic sequence of red, white, and blue, casting her darkened house in an eerie, shifting glow. It was time for the grand finale. With a final click, the outdoor projector whirred to life, casting a massive bar graph onto my garage door. The energy consumption data, meticulously compiled, was now on full public display. Each house on the block was represented by a modest green or yellow bar. And then there was Carol's, a towering, pulsating crimson pillar of energy waste, easily 3 times taller than anyone else's. The label beneath it, stark and undeniable, flashed brightly. Highest consumption 12 Maple Lane. A ripple of murmuring spread through the darkness. Neighbors, drawn by the unexpected pockets of light, began to emerge from their homes, their faces illuminated by the ghostly glow of the projector. They stared at the graph, then at Carol's absurdly lit yet still powerless house, then back at my brightly lit sanctuary. The dots connected. Phones appeared, capturing the surreal scene. Laughter began to bubble up through the darkness. The front door of 12 Maple Lane slammed open, and Carol emerged, her silhouette a study in righteous fury. Her voice, amplified by the sudden silence of the powerless neighborhood, shrieked into the night, but her words were lost in the growing tide of bewildered amusement. Operation Beacon of Justice was a resounding, glorious success. The grid power returned at precisely 11 p.m., the streetlights humming back to life, my strategically powered pockets of light fading into the renewed normalcy. The projector whirred to a stop, the damning bar graph vanishing from my garage door. But the digital genie was out of the bottle. The neighborhood's group chat was a nuclear meltdown of emojis and astonished commentary. The emergency HOA meeting on Sunday afternoon was the stuff of legend. Held in the community gazebo under a surprisingly sunny sky, it was the most well-attended gathering in the history of Maple Creek Estates. Every lawn chair and folding stool was occupied, and a significant number of residents were standing around the perimeter, their faces a mixture of curiosity and barely suppressed glee. Carol, still radiating an aura of aggrieved indignation, attempted to conduct the meeting, launching into a lengthy, accusation-laced tirade against me for digital vandalism, utility tampering, and general unneighborly conduct. "This blatant attack on our community," she declared, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage, "by a rogue element who clearly has no respect for our bylaws or our beigeness." A voice cut through her diatribe, quiet but firm. "Cut it out, Carol." The entire gazebo fell silent. Everyone turned to see Dave, the usually quiet neighbor from across the street, standing up. Dave, who I'd only ever exchanged polite nods with, the owner of the aforementioned graphite gray security camera. "We're tired of it, Carol," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "The endless notices, the ridiculous fines, the constant feeling of being micromanaged. And Carol," he added, a wry smile playing on his lips, "my security camera, which is, for the record, graphite gray, happened to record a certain individual lurking around Alex's utility box during the storm last Thursday. Funny that." That was the spark that ignited the powder keg. One by one, other neighbors rose to share their own tales of Carol's petty tyranny, the woman fined for having a slightly too tall bird feeder, the family reprimanded for the unauthorized placement of a welcome mat, the countless nitpicky violations that had made life in Maple Creek Estates feel less like a community and more like a tightly controlled penal colony. A motion for a vote of no confidence was proposed, seconded, and passed with a resounding 48-1. Carol's own furious vote being the sole dissenting voice. The reign of the beige baroness was officially over. Dave, looking utterly bewildered, was reluctantly elected the new HOA president. His first official act was to propose the immediate and permanent abolishment of the Architectural Compliance Committee, the very committee Carol had weaponized with such zealous efficiency. The motion passed unanimously, accompanied by a spontaneous round of applause. The aftermath was surreal. Instead of being the neighborhood pariah, I was suddenly some kind of folk hero, the tech-savvy underdog who had dared to stand up to the tyrannical HOA president. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now waved enthusiastically, some even stopping by to inquire about the feasibility of installing their own solar panels. Mrs. Henderson brought over a triple batch of her famous chocolate chip cookies, declaring me a blessing in disguise. A few weeks later, the dust had settled, and a semblance of normalcy had returned to Maple Creek Estates, albeit a slightly less beige and considerably more relaxed normalcy. I was on my porch, enjoying a well-deserved beer, Faraday snoozing contentedly at my feet. Gus was just packing up his tools, having finished installing a small solar array for Dave at what he called a neighborly solidarity discount. "You know," Gus said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, "you started something. Got 3 more calls this week about them battery backup systems. All of them said, I want the setup Alex has." I grinned, taking a long swig of my beer. "Just tell them it's the Carol Proof package." I watched as the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in hues far more interesting than any shade of white. The streetlights flickered on, no longer symbols of oppressive conformity, but simply lights. My phone buzzed. A text from Mark. "Mark. So, heard you're a local hero. When are we starting our own ISP?" I chuckled, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting. I'd come to Maple Creek Estates seeking peace and quiet, a stable internet connection, and a yard for my dog. What I found was a battle against bureaucratic absurdity and the unexpected satisfaction of not just fixing a broken system, but illuminating its flaws for all to see. I typed a quick reply. "Give me 4 minutes."